seminar this afternoon. I want to welcome everyone here to the second in the Center for the Study of Cooperatives 2012 International Year of the Cooperatives seminar series. And as was mentioned at the last seminar, we've got quite a number of very interesting presentations coming up. And we're kind of building toward a crescendo, if you will, into our fall seminar series as well as we finish out the International Year. So this year, or for this seminar, this is a very special one. It's a commemorative seminar. It's in honor of a scholarship that was given to the center to support students who were either studying with the center or studying cooperative topics in other disciplinary areas. And it's the FJH for Dean Memorial Scholarship Seminar. I'm going to in a minute introduce one of the members of the Ferdine family. We've been running this seminar, this very special part of our seminar series now for about 4 years, I think. I was trying to remember when we really started. And the way that it works is that a student who receives a scholarship from a previous year is then invited back to present the outcome of their research that they conducted with the support of the scholarship itself. And we take the opportunity then to invite members of the Ferdine family to join us and for them to have a chance to meet the students and to learn about the research that's being supported by the family scholarship. So I'm very pleased to recognize two members of the Ferdine family who are with us today. Margaret, it's always lovely to see you here. And Ken, thank you very much for joining us again. I'm going to actually ask Ken to talk a little bit about the scholarship, the basis of the scholarship, and the person in whose memory it has been created. And then Ken is going to introduce our speaker for today. So please welcome Ken.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm actually more interested in listening to her speak, so I'll only say a few words on behalf of the family. Thank you so much. It's a good turnout and impressive one. This is an interesting scholarship because looking at the sign here, this little sign here is something we grew up with here in Saskatchewan. And it's something that has sort of changed over time and become, I think, maybe a little more corporate. But I think the roots of it always are around cooperatives and what they mean. And I think from a personal standpoint, but certainly something we grew up with, is that cooperatives have always been a different economic model to how we can operate in this world. And I think the crisis we've been through and that we continue to live through has to cause us to learn and look at alternatives to how we develop, not only within Canada and how we structure ourselves here in the economy, but also, more importantly, I think, in developing parts of the world where the economic model might be to have some foreign company come in and develop a resource that otherwise could be developed in a cooperative way. And I think the beauty of what you've done here in your research, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but is to bring gender into that equation. And I think that's the other part of the world that we live in that we better start figuring out, is how we equalize the table in terms of the gender issues that exist. I think if you could solve one problem, it would be solving the gender problem that we have throughout the world. And if you could do that, I think a lot of the other problems we have would follow with it. So I'm really interested to hear your work, and like I said, my mother and I are more interested in hearing you speak than me. I think this scholarship was simply a consequence of something we believed in as a family and continue to believe in. That is that we need to provide money for people like you to do your research so we can understand better how cooperatives could be applied in other parts of the world and also in Canada. So I read all of the submissions that came in this year. Actually, I think all of us read all of them, and incredible work that all of you are doing. So for those of you who are in these studies, thank you so much for doing what you're doing to add to the debate and discussion and dialogue. And for those of you who are thinking about it, it's very valuable work, and don't ever underestimate the importance of the work you do. So well done. Jannie, I won't say much about your work because I think you're going to speak for it yourself. It's just that the fair trade movement was something that my father was probably one of the first buyers of a fair trade product, certainly in Saskatchewan, because it probably came late to Saskatchewan and to other parts of Canada. But so it's something that we've always understood and believed in and still support today. So what your research has done, I think, will really help us understand better when an academic and really knows about the area gets into it and really tell us about it. So thanks so much for your interest and efforts. And on behalf of the Deans, thanks very much to all of you for coming. And we look forward to supporting the scholarship going forward. It's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret and Ken, for being here. And thank you, everyone else. And it's been such an honor to be able to come and present on my work and have people come and listen to me talk about my work. Audrey and Karen had prepared some fair trade coffee and tea and some treats, so feel free to have a drink and listen and sip your coffee. I want this to be more of an informal discussion, exchange, dialogue, so I had planned to talk for about 40-45 minutes with some time for questions and discussion afterwards, but also throughout, I have a few questions I'd like to pose to you, and yeah, if you have questions at any point, feel free to just interrupt. It would be nice just to kind of have more of a dialogue type of presentation. So yes, I'm presenting on my thesis research, which was titled Making the Invisible Count, looking at gender equity in one fair trade coffee cooperative in Nicaragua. So this was done as part of my master's thesis in community health and epidemiology here. So it's great that interdisciplinarity, that co-ops kind of touched all these broad fields, and for me to be able to do work in this area. So I'm just gonna, for a brief overview, I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about fair trade and gender, giving a bit about the context in Nicaragua, and then talking a bit more about the study questions and methods that I used for my thesis research, and then talking about the actual gender equity indicators I had come up with in my project, and then discussing a bit of what does it all mean, a bit of the more broader implications of my study. So maybe just for me to get to know you guys a bit better, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Just to know a bit more about you, if you're affiliated with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives, could you raise your hand? Okay, so quite a few of you. If you've been to Nicaragua before, can you raise your hand? Okay, we have a few. Who has heard of fair trade before? Raise your hand. And who likes to drink coffee? Raise your hand. Okay, you too. Okay, great. Okay, that kind of helps to know like who's in the audience and how to structure my talk. So then just to start out, what are some things you can tell me about fair trade? Or what is it about fair trade that makes it different than conventional trade? Like, what does fair trade mean?
I see it as producers receiving a fair earning on what they produced.
So a fair price, so a higher price. So the producers would get a higher price than in the conventional market. Yes?
More environmentally friendly production methods?
Right, so there's a lot of standards around how the farming works, and they prohibit use of certain chemicals. Anything else? Okay, well that's a good start. So I'm just gonna, for me to understand fair trade, I see it better through the eyes of the producers or the eyes of people. So maybe I'll try to illustrate these differences through a couple people. So I'll start with the conventional coffee chain. So can someone name like a conventional coffee company, like one of the big, Nabob. Okay, we'll start. So this will be a Nabob coffee company. So we're going to look through the eyes of one of the coffee producers. Let's call her Dionisia. So she's a small-scale coffee farmer in a community in Nicaragua. So her family members help with the harvest. And in coffee production, small-scale farmers do most of the work, and it's very labor-intensive. And it's also, it takes up the largest proportion of human resources in coffee production. So she harvests the coffee. I think I'm pointing this at the wrong direction. Oh, at the computer. Oh, it doesn't. Or maybe projector?
Is the banner in the way?
Oh, there we go. I think I have to angle it like this. Okay, so Dionisia harvests her coffee. She sells it to an intermediary who, it could be a few steps of a few intermediaries, and sells it to Nabob Coffee. And then So the money she gets is directly from this person. So this is how she gets her earnings. So about how much is it to buy a cup of coffee here? Like if you went to a coffee shop, how much is it for? Yeah, about $1.50?
$2.50, $3
Okay. Okay, yeah, so let's say $2 just because my math it's easier for me to work in numbers. So if you paid $2 for a cup of coffee, Dionysia will receive around 4 to 10% of that. So she'd be getting about 20 cents of that money. So most of the value part is kind of in the north and belongs to these large companies. And then the other issue with that is coffee prices fluctuate. It goes through cyclical fluctuations, so the prices are often very unstable. So from one year she could be doing well and get a lot of money from her harvest, the next year she could get really little. So that instability really makes her vulnerable to world prices, and if her family's dependent on that income, that really affects whether or not her children can go to school, whether or not she can have food for the rest of the year. So you really see small-scale farmers vulnerable to the world market. So now we're going to look at the fair trade. It doesn't like me. There we go. Okay, so we're going to look at the fair trade story. So can someone tell me a fair trade brand? You can even just look on the table and see what fair trade brands there are. Anyone? Bean North, right. So the coffee there is provided by a company called Bean North. So they're one of the fair trade certified companies. So we'll use them as an example. So we have, okay, so this will be Sara, and she's also a small scale coffee farmer, but the difference is that she belongs to a fair trade cooperative that sells to Bean North, let's say. So being part of a fair trade cooperative means she's part of a democratically organized organization, and she has voting power in there. And the cooperative also provides services like low interest credit loans, technical assistance, training workshops, and also being part of fair trade, there's this long-term partnership between the buyer and the producer. So Bean North has this long-term agreement with this cooperative, so it gives that stability. It gives a closer relationship between the producers and the buyers. And it also guarantees a minimum price, as Ken was saying. So fair trade coffee, they give a minimum price right now of $1.40 per pound to the farmers. And that makes a big difference both in terms of stability and the price. And an important part of fair trade is that part of the price you pay, it goes to a social premium. So right now 20 cents per pound goes directly to the cooperative, and the cooperative votes on what they can invest it for. So it's typically used for community development initiatives like providing school materials for children in the community, or organizing clinics, health clinics in the community. So it benefits not just the cooperative, but the community that they're living in. So that's kind of a basic snapshot of the difference between fair trade and conventional trade. And I chose to tell these two stories through the eyes of women. And that's kind of a different take on fair trade, because this is kind of the traditional face of coffee production. We have Juan Valdez, who kind of sells, I think it's Nabob coffee. And women have traditionally been invisible in the story of coffee production, because coffee production done by small-scale farming families, women's work is kind of considered invisible within family, like it's kind of unpaid labor. But actually, when you look at coffee production, the work in it is pretty highly gendered. Women are generally more involved in the labor-intensive work in the cultivation and collection of coffee, but they're not so much involved in the processing or the commercialization of it. So you really see these different roles that men and women do in coffee. And a lot of these studies looking at the impacts of fair trade focus on social or environmental benefits, but they often treat it all as one category and don't look at the specific experiences of women who participate very differently. And we see there's a growing number of women-only fair trade coffee cooperatives, and this kind of suggests that there's not enough attention given to, or there's inadequate attention given to women's issues, and their needs aren't being addressed. So that's kind of how this study came about. There's an international partnership, which my supervisor, Lori Hansen, is part of, and it's looking at fair trade, gender equity, and health in Nicaragua, and it's a group of 14 researchers, cooperatives, and organizations looking at this issue. And this partnership identified the need for a way to measure gender equity in order to be able to go forward with this agenda of looking at fair trade and gender equity in Nicaragua. So it was a good time that I was working with Lori, and I came in and worked on this project. Looking at ways that we can measure gender equity and fair trade. So I'm going to ask you some questions. So I'm talking about gender equity here, and we've all probably heard of that term, but what does gender equity look like? Like, what are some ways that we compare the position of men and women that we have been using that?
Income.
Yeah, we look at income differences between men and women. That's a good example. Are there other ways we've been looking at it?
Labor conditions.
Right, so working conditions, maybe the amount of hours they're working or the type of work they're doing, comparing that between men and women.
Family responsibilities.
Right, so maybe division of work in the household or like childcare, unpaid work. Yes?
I think sometimes it's a question of discourse, whether the women and the men recognize the women as being farmers or in their own right, and whether they recognize the work they do and count it.
So it's kind of a level of awareness around gender or gender inequities.
And, the whole framing of the discussion in a sense.
Yeah, those are really great points. And so from that, we just see there's so many different ways of looking at gender and gender equity. And gender equity is such a subjective or normative concept, so it could mean different things in different contexts. So, and especially in the context of fair trade and cooperatives, where cooperatives are so different between regions, between countries, and between sectors. So it's really important first when we look at gender equity to define what does gender equity mean and how can we measure that. So my first research question was, what indicators best measure gender equity in the cooperative Prococer? So because of all these nuances of looking at gender, I decided to partner with one cooperative and look more in depth into gender and look specifically within this cooperative, what does gender equity mean? And how do we know things are changing? How do we know there's improved gender equity? So in order to understand this question, I'm going to give a bit more context about Nicaragua. A few people have been here, so maybe they can help me out. So Nicaragua is in Central America. The population is about 6 million people, and it's largely agricultural communities and quite spread out population as well over some isolated and rural communities. And in terms of rankings, just a few statistics. Nicaragua is second to Haiti in poverty rankings in the Americas. About a third of its rural population has challenges with functional literacy, and about a quarter of its population doesn't have access to clean water. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of living conditions in that country. And also a little bit more about the history of the country. So Nicaragua in 1979, they had a revolution where a leftist organization called the FSLN, they overthrew a corrupt dictatorship, and they implemented a lot of progressive reforms, such as an agrarian reform where a lot of the land was redistributed to the farmers that were farming it. They had this cooperative movement that kind of flourished under that time. Yeah, it was just they created a lot of these reforms that enabled more progressive policies to be put in place. That has since changed a bit with the change in governments. There's been more conservative governments in power, but this kind of legacy of this revolution has kind of stayed and fostered a lot of the initiatives taking place right now. And coffee is one of the important export industries in Nicaragua. About 25% of the income from agricultural exports comes from coffee. And about 90% of the coffee producers are small scale. Another important thing to talk about in Nicaragua is also the women's movement. They have a really strong history of women's organizing, and it's been described as one of the most dynamic and diverse social movements in Nicaragua. And there's many networks of women's organizations that have very strong civil society. And it's within these women's movements that there's calls for greater attention to gender equity and fair trade. So there are a lot of this kind of demand to look more at gender and fair trade in Nicaragua is coming from a lot of these movements. And the organization I worked with, ProCoser, the acronym translates into the Multi-Sectoral Cooperative of Organic Coffee Producers in Nicaragua. And they're one of the organizations of the International Partnership, and I partnered specifically with them to work on this study. So they're made up of 657 members. About 150 of them are women. And they're located in northern Nicaragua, right by the Honduras border. And they're spread out. They're in terms of geographic area, they're quite spread out over 71 communities. And often some of them are very isolated. So there's a lot of challenges in bringing services to all these communities and communicating with them. And their main objective is to commercialize coffee, but a lot of their members also produce beans, corn, handicrafts. They own corner stores, so it's that's why they call it multi-sectoral. There's a lot of other sectors coming into play, but the majority of it is coffee. And they provide a lot of services to their members, like credit programs, technical assistance, training workshops, scholarships, social services, and one thing about cooperatives in Nicaragua, as you see, as the state has been increasingly moving back and providing less and less services to its population. A lot of the cooperatives have been stepping up and providing a lot of these services to the populations that they need, like providing scholarships or providing health clinics or education workshops. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic within these cooperatives and their relationship with the members. And in terms of women in the cooperative, so ProCoser, they want to increase the participation of women in the cooperative. That's one of the reasons why they're part of this partnership. So they recently contracted a gender specialist to kind of work on this and started a gender committee, and they're in the process of creating cooperative policies on gender equity. So the gender specialist was my counterpart throughout the course of my study. And in terms of women's involvement in the cooperative, so there's 157 members. There's also a lot of women that they call co-producers, who are wives or partners or daughters of men cooperative members, but they also contribute to the cultivation, production of coffee as a family member, and their work isn't, they aren't paid specifically for their work. It's kind of under the family, so we call them co-producers. And ProCoser also has a program called GEMAS, which is a group of women that promotes kind of small loans or savings accounts and other training workshops. So these could be the wives or the daughters of the cooperative members, or they could also be women in the communities they work with. So that's another way that women have been involved in ProCoser. So then to talk about my study, I did this study over, I spent in total 8 months in Nicaragua. 2 months of that was taking a course through this university, and then the other 6 months I spent doing field research, a lot of it learning Spanish and immersing myself in this community. And this study, I framed it around community-based participatory research and also feminist research methods, because I felt we had been talking a bit about gender equity, and it's such a subjective concept that it's really important that we make sure when we talk about how to measure this, that we look at the perspectives of the people who are going to be using this tool. So using these community-based methods, I'm really valuing the lived experiences of these people and using this knowledge to create these tools that they will be ultimately be using. So that's kind of where I come from in terms of this project. And the methods I started with a literature review of gender equity indicators in the literature, and also that has been used in Nicaragua. And a lot of it I used documents that I got from the cooperative from Prococer and also from other organizations in Nicaragua. So that's kind of the starting point. And then I conducted interviews with cooperative staff members and focus groups with women producers and co-producers that are associated with the cooperative. And then from these, I created a draft set of indicators to measure gender equity. And then with this draft, I went back to all the members I had talked to and said, what do you think about this? And asked for their feedback. And then also talked to 2 people that were external to the cooperative and got their feedback, just a different perspective outside of the cooperative. And then finally came up with this final indicator set that the cooperative would use to evaluate its gender, or to measure gender equity in their cooperative. Oh, I should go back. So one thing, so I tried to prioritize as much as possible the information I got from the focus groups with the members of the cooperative and with the co-producers. So the focus groups I did were kind of structured as workshops, because a lot of the work that they do in the community is structured as these kind of participatory reciprocal workshops. So while I was interviewing them, doing these focus groups, asking them what gender equity means, I was also sharing knowledge with them that I know about fair trade, and it became more of this exchange and dialogue, but also a way to get information for my research. So for the results, so for talking about the indicators, so from the data, it became apparent that when we look at gender equity, it's not just about looking at women's access to resources or comparing numbers between men and women, but it's more important to frame it in terms of control. It's not like access to resources isn't enough. We need to look at, are they actually controlling the resources, and are we looking at these power relationships between men and women? So it was important to kind of frame it within this empowerment framework and placing women at the center of this. So a lot of the measures compared men and women, but some of them only looked at women because there's some experiences of women that aren't comparable to men's, and we need to look at that within as important in its own right. And then empowerment is kind of, it's a personal process, but it's also a collective process. So looking at individuals, but also within the cooperative, and gender equity kind of in more collective sense. So then, and from the data, interviews with the cooperative staff, they really highlighted that the cooperative Prococer has the potential to influence gender equity in the cooperative, in their members, but also they have a desire to influence gender equity in the families as well and in the communities. So it's not just the economics of being in a cooperative, but it's also this thing that could spread out to the families, communities, and be kind of addressing more the root causes of why there are inequities. So it was framed around 4 areas, so economic empowerment, political empowerment, sociocultural, and well-being. And then within these 4 dimensions, there's concepts. There's more specific concepts within these dimensions that were measured using indicators. And because there's quite a bit, and for the purposes of time, I'll just go through one as an example just to show the process of how the data kind of led to the creation of indicators to measure that. Oh, and if you have more questions about these indicators, we can talk about it at the end, but just because there's a few, and I'll just talk about it more broadly. So in total, we came up with 22 indicators that they can use currently, like with the current state of what the cooperative is doing. These indicators are applicable to them now. And then I suggested 7 indicators that they can integrate at a future point as their gender strategy evolves, because this is kind of a changing process, and they're in the process of developing all these tools. So it was important just to acknowledge that change and these shifts and these progressions that happen when we talk about gender and organizational contexts. So I'm going to give an example of one indicator. So in the economic category, there's one indicator about credit. And the issue of credit loans came up a lot because, as one of the members said, without credit, one can't work. They lose their farms if there isn't credit. So there's a recognition that credit is so important. But then what does gender equity in credit mean? How can we measure that? So one of the members said, there's almost no capacity for credit. They give us maybe a quarter of what one asks for. That is what we need the most. So it's not just about access to credit, but it's how much as well, how much they need. So because the cooperative has been suggesting indicators of how many women have credit loans and comparing that to how many men. So this quote kind of shows that's not enough. There's another dimension that we need to look at. And this was one of the women I had interviewed that wasn't working with the cooperative. I called her an external expert. She was saying, often in credit services, they say, no, we have a gender focus, and so we give credit loans to women. But when you look at the credit portfolio, the larger invested sums are with the men. So maybe I'll ask you, in terms of getting loans, like you think of getting loans from a bank, what are some things you need in order to get a loan? Collateral, right? So collateral, it could be land. Like in the case of Nicaragua, collateral is often in a legal land title. And this is an issue because in Nicaragua, in 2003, only about 22% of women held the legal land titles. So that in itself is a big barrier that prevents women from being able to access resources. Even if there's no discrimination against women, they have these barriers that makes it a challenge for them to get collateral. So in an earlier draft, the indicator kind of shifted to be looking at how much the sum of the credit loans that women had and the sum that the men had and comparing those. But when I talked to the gender specialist in the cooperative, she said she disagreed with that indicator. She said, I asked for a credit loan according to what my capacity for payment is and according to what I need. Depending on what I have, what I farm, this is the size of a loan. She's saying that you can't just compare the amount between men and women because they have different sized farms, they have different capacities, so it's not really useful to measure it in that way. So in the end, what the indicator became, I came up with two indicators. One was actually asking the members if they feel they have sufficient access to credit. So more of a value question, how much do you feel like you have enough credit based on what you need? And then a second question to add another dimension to that. The applications people make for the credit loans, how much of them are approved? So are the women and the men meeting the requirements of the credit loans? And this was kind of a reflection of the cooperative's new directions into trying to find or trying to offer more loans that accommodate the barriers that women have. So finding loans that are less stringent on what kind of collateral they need. Some loans, they just require a guarantor for them to be able to have a loan instead of requesting this land title, which is hard for a lot of women to get a loan. So that's kind of the end result of the indicators, and that's kind of the process I would go through for most of the indicators in terms of choosing them, and also based on what data was available to the cooperative and making sure we have these indicators, but they're also able to get information easily and cheaply to be able to assess these and actually use them. So then the second part of my research was the question of what can be learned about the participatory process of indicator development. I talked about gender equity being a very subjective concept, so it was very important in this project to use participatory processes and talk to the women and ask them what they think gender equity is instead of me as an outsider coming and deciding what gender equity is. And when I was looking through the literature on participatory methods, this was actually not something that's done a whole lot when you're developing indicators. It's usually a researcher that kind of develops these indicators based on the knowledge that they have. So it was really interesting in this study to kind of look at using participatory methods for these means, and what does that look like, and what can we learn from that process? And a lot of the findings from this question, I feel, are as important as the actual indicators that we came up with. So in terms of participation, I see participation as kind of a spectrum instead of a yes or no dichotomy, where you can have on the lower end of participation where it's more like consulting the community or consulting the participants in the study. And the high end is engaging the participants in the design of the study and analyzing the data and working together to kind of work on the study together. So I see it as a spectrum. This study was kind of more towards the low end of the participatory spectrum. And there's a lot of factors that contributed to that. So the next few slides, I'll kind of talk about what happened in the study and what worked and what didn't work and what we learned from it. So one big factor in trying to use participatory methods was just logistical or practical factors. So ProCoSER works in a lot of rural and isolated communities, and there's heavy rains during certain seasons, and the roads are just hard to access. So there are a lot of practical, logistical difficulties of going out into these communities. So I was able to talk to women from 2 different communities only. I would have liked to have gone to more communities and talked to more women because the regions are so different, and there's so many differences between all the municipalities and the departments. But there were a lot of difficulties in doing that, especially when I only had 6 months as a master's research project. And also the reality of working with this one small cooperative, which they had a lot of human and financial resources constraints, and a lot of the staff were very busy. It's hard to find time to work with them. They didn't have a lot of resources to implement kind of this study or some of my recommendations. So there's also what's ideal and what's practically doable within the means available to a small cooperative. Yeah, and another factor that played into it was kind of, there were many different conceptualizations of what gender equity means. So a very challenging part of developing these indicators was trying to balance all these different perspectives and also trying to prioritize the experiences of the people who will be using this and who are experiencing this and who are part of the cooperative. There was, in terms of this cooperative I worked with and the region in the north, there hasn't been a lot of gender work done in the cooperative. So when I was doing the focus groups and talking to the women about what does gender equity mean to you or what does it look like, it was very difficult because a lot of these women haven't been asked this before ever and have not thought about this before. So it was hard for them to articulate at this moment what it could look like because it hasn't been something they had thought about or asked. So that was a very challenging part in terms of understanding what it could mean. And there has to be this kind of balance between what they're saying, but also the need to kind of integrate critical perspectives within that. So take their lived experiences, but also using it in a way that leads to meaningful change and a critical analysis of gender. And then another factor that influenced the study was kind of this emerging partnership I had with ProCoSER. So it was a new relationship that I had with this cooperative. And whenever you're working with organizations, and especially in a context like Nicaragua, where I'm from the north, they're in the south, and there's so many issues of power and privilege, there was a lot of mistrust, and it's hard to work through that, especially when a lot of the financial resources that the cooperative gets comes from NGOs or non-governmental organizations and organizations from the north. So I kind of represent a potential donor. So there's this awkward relationship where I could be a connection for them in the north to get funds. And also I'm working with gender. So there was just this kind of negotiation or dance around these power relationships. And also the leadership of the cooperative had certain agendas, and they had certain reasons for engaging in this project. I think they felt that gender equity was important, but most of the leadership were made of men, so they thought it was important, but they also felt other issues were maybe more important than gender. So they were interested in this project, but it wasn't like their number one on their list. So a lot of those kind of things came into play as well. So in developing these indicators, it became a question of one of the writers, one of the literature I was looking through, they put it in such a good way, asking how fast is too fast, or knowing when to gauge how much to push and how much not to push in terms of developing these indicators and how critical to make it, but risking them not wanting to use it because it's pushing too much, or just kind of balancing that kind of the practical reality or the realistic part of them actually using them, or is it just not going to be critical enough? So it was kind of a hard balance. And then finally, an important part of the project I felt was that sense of reciprocity. So I was partnering with this organization. I was doing my thesis study with them, so I was getting a lot out of them. But it's also important to kind of support them in what they feel is important and support them in terms of their needs. So often when we do research in academic settings, what comes out of it is published papers, conference presentations, but these things don't really mean much to ProCoSER as a cooperative. So then in terms of my study, it was important to frame it in terms of an action research project. So what is it that the cooperative needs and how can I support them in that? So one of the things when I was doing research with them, they had talked to me about, they had been wanting to create a database of socioeconomic information of all its cooperative members. So they wanted questionnaires of how to collect this information and also how to analyze it. So it was kind of a good time that I was there. Data and those kind of things really excite me. So I was able to work with them, and we developed this questionnaire that they could, and we trained volunteers to go out to all the communities and collect this information on the members, and then enter it into a computer in a database and analyze it. So they have all this data they could use to learn more about their members and figure out what services they could be directing their resources towards. So it was actually also really useful for these indicators because a lot of the indicators were structured around how these questions were asked or what information would come from that. So it became this tool that was realistic for them to actually apply. And with these indicators, I was able to develop a report for them in Spanish and showing them, explaining what each indicator is, how they can get the data for it, how they can use it. And this went to the cooperative ProCoSER, but also to the organizations in the research partnership. So hopefully it'll be a resource for them that they could be applying and using with their gender policies. Yeah, so finally, in coming up with this thesis study, one of the main outputs was coming up with this evaluation tool that these cooperatives could use to assess gender equity and assess changes in gender equity and what areas need more resources or more attention. And while I made this specific to one cooperative, to ProCoSER, the broader areas that it touches on, it could be used by other cooperatives, and it has been given to other cooperatives for their use. And also, and I think another thing that came out of my study was just, I had talked about the women never being asked how they would like to participate in the cooperative or how they see gender equity looking like. So the focus groups that I did was one opportunity to start these discussions and providing a space for women to think about these issues and talk about them. And hopefully this will start a process of dialogue within the cooperative and between these women to think more about gender equity. And I think it's when you can start dreaming of it and thinking about it that these changes can happen, or that you can start thinking about how you can make these changes happen. So it was really great to be able to be part of that process. Yeah, so I think that's time. So I just wanted to thank the Fredine family and the Center for the Study of Cooperatives for supporting my work and welcoming me here, and also the other funders that I had that made this possible. So the Department of Community Health and Epidemiology, the Global Health Committee, and the International Research Office. And of course my supervisor, Lori, and my committee member. Yeah, and thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Go ahead.
Do you think the women have a much better chance to become a part of society with a cooperative base?
That's a good question. I think so. You see, when you talk to a lot of the women, the cooperative serves on one part economic means. The cooperative gives them credit loans, technical assistance, but then it also serves as this kind of social, it also serves social and political areas as well. You hear women talking about just having so much more support and having that sense of solidarity with other workers, and also being able to go to all these training workshops and learning, and being able to develop all these other skills outside of economics, and just feeling more part of civil society outside of their home. And I really felt that, or noticed that about the cooperative movement there, where it wasn't just about economics. It was actually this movement and this sense of community and this kind of value people took on, that they saw the world differently and participated a bit differently as well. So yeah, I definitely think it's happening. There's a lot more potential, definitely, and a lot of more work that could be done in terms of looking at the barriers to women participating in cooperatives and kind of expanding that and broadening that. So yes, I think yes.
I'll just help you look for questions.
Oh, sure. I think Lori had a question too. Hey.
Did the men in the cooperative feel at all threatened by your research?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yes. So I had talked a bit about negotiating all those power relationships and working with a cooperative. It was really hard. And I think one of the things I really noticed was when I first talked to them about doing these focus groups, and I said, I only wanted to talk to the women. There was a bit of an awkward kind of, there was an awkward exchange around that, because I was talking to this one leadership member, and he felt that, well, I think men would also benefit as well. And I kind of had to say, well, yes, I think that's true. I would like men to participate, but I also think it's important for women to have their own space and to be more comfortable talking amongst women. And I mean, ultimately, he agreed, or he let me do it, but there was always that awkward tension that I was only working with the women, and he actually wanted to participate, but he's like, well, I can't because I'm a man. And you know, there was that kind of sense, there's a sense that it wasn't fair, but then I also think that's an important part of it. Like, I think that's an important discussion to kind of open up, and an important place to kind of start talking about it, especially when most of the leadership were men. And yeah, so there is a lot of, I felt like I kind of walked into this cooperative, and there's already these gender dynamics happening there, and I'm kind of this outsider that's kind of different. And I'm a woman, but I'm different, and so it was kind of an interesting relationship to kind of navigate, for sure. Yeah.
Lori, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I was just going to bolster a couple of the points that you made, because you say them quite humbly, and I know for a fact that in follow-up to the study, and as well in additional things that were going on in the ground, that the value of some of both the approach that was being used, as well as both the documents that were produced by Jannie and some of the other organizations where there was spin-off. So you claimed at one point that you're sort of in the level of things, that it was a fairly low level of participation. Well, it depends on what you're comparing that with, because if you compare it to much of what is social research, I think you'd find something closer to the high end in what you did, actually. But fair enough, that's your assessment. Your reciprocity though, speaks to just other aspects that are actually related to that whole issue of participation, how you get to know, how you got to know the cooperative, and how you got to move that sort of level of distrust to a level of relative trust within a relatively short period of time, at least with some of the people that you were working with, is worthy of mention. And you did that not by doing things even within the study. Those were about the baseball games that you did after the training sessions where you're working with the youth. Those were about the workshops that you offered. They came up with a manual, her and another colleague that was from the department who was also doing her master's thesis at the time, called Where There Is No Path. And they carried out workshops in rural communities with groups of women, teaching them about some issues around reproductive health. Those extra things made that trust grow and made the level, in my mind, of participation that was going on in the study grow. So I think, don't underestimate yourself around where you think the levels of that study went. And in follow-up, post your study, I know that those indicators are being used not so much by Procoser, because I've only been there a couple of times since, but by other organizations that are part of that partnership. So there was spin-off from it, and it's worth, I think, bolstering what Jannie claims, because I have a longer sort of history in the bigger picture there, and so it's worth just sort of bolstering your own claims.
Thank you, Lori.
Before Murray asked the question, Jannie, did you have anything in response to Lori there?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it was interesting. I think the very great thing about this project was that it wasn't just my study. It was part of a bigger thing that has been going on and will be going on. So while I just did this as a master's study for 6 months, it was great to be part of, knowing that you're part of something longer term. So knowing that something came out of my research and that would be, and other people will be building on that later. So it's not just a one-off thing. So it was really great to be part of that. And yeah.
So we have Murray and John.
Thanks, Jannie. Really enjoyed that. You talked about your indicators. Could you give us some sense of what you found with what the indicators told you? What's the level of gender equity here? Presumably these were actually being used, right? In some way. So what did they find? What if you apply them? What do you find?
Right. So the tricky thing is, I don't believe they've actually been applied as of yet. They had been talking about, they're going through strategic planning around their gender work. So these indicators might be kind of informing the directions they want to be going with their gender strategy. I'm not sure if it's actually been applied yet, mostly because of data issues. The ability for them to apply the indicators depends on their ability to collect data using the socioeconomic database. So I'm not quite sure in terms of the status of gender equity as of yet. But in terms of my feeling of it, based on what came out of the data, I felt that gender equity, it was a tricky thing because I felt like when they talked about gender equity, it was more about equality. It was more about not discriminating based on sex and not so much about acknowledging these barriers that women have and addressing those. So I think they're doing more initiatives such as women's groups or looking at numbers of membership between men and women. So that's definitely a start. It's more than a lot of cooperatives are doing in that area. But it's also, I see these indicators as a way to help conceptualize gender equity beyond equality, beyond just discrimination, and looking more at, okay, are women actually participating in the same way or benefiting in the same way, recognizing the unique position of women that they have. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah.
Well, first an observation. I was really impressed with how you involved the audience at the beginning, found out a bit about who the audience is, and involved them in a little bit of feedback. Now, thinking of the impact, and I think you may have had more impact than you realize, and you mentioned that others will continue to develop some of these ideas. Who are those others?
Lori's future students. Wow. I guess, Lori, do you want to help me answer that?
Well, there's a couple of things that have happened since and that are ongoing things. Jannie was in one cooperative called Prococer that's part of a larger organization called Cafinica that is the sort of the national umbrella of small producer organizations in Nicaragua. And that organization has within it a women's movement that it calls itself a women's movement. It's not an autonomous movement, but it's made up of all the women producers and co-producers in the country. And they have a number of programs that are ongoing that, in fact, they are utilizing things like Jannie's and other pieces of information that are coming out of whether it's student projects or other people that are there that are working as, alongside them in other roles to facilitate the development of their own strategic plan as well as their programs. So they have, for example, a women's leadership program that there are members of Prococer that are part of it, but all the women leaders across all of the cooperatives are also part of it. So they're working on some of that. The research doesn't lead the whole process. That's an independent process of the research, but the research adds tools or pieces of information, some of them hopefully in strategic places, and it continues to evolve. Right now, there are currently no studies going on with that group because there's a document we're all waiting to see from FLO. That's 2 years overdue at this point, but I've talked to FLO is the Fair Trade Labeling Organization. It's the international organization that has within it a whole structure that is examining the issue of gender at the international level. And for several years now, there's been sort of this dance between what happens at that level and what happens in countries like Nicaragua in terms of where the push for gender comes from and whether or not there's going to be, for example, a standard added to the list of required standards for having fair trade labeling on your products that's related to gender. There's a bit of a dance going on, and of course that's a very, very, very important issue when you think about whether or not you retain your labeling, depending on whether or not you have gender programming. That's a pretty important push for the entire program. So that document's not out yet, and the decision's not made yet, and that's sort of an ongoing thing, and people are on hold in a way, waiting to see whether that's going to happen. And likewise, so is the program of research in a way. We're sort of waiting to see what might be next.
Yeah, I just had a question around land ownership. I may have got the number wrong, but I take it to be a member of the cooperative, you had to be a producer.
Yes.
Not necessarily a landowner.
Oh yeah, see, that was a very tricky part. The issue of land is very tricky because under cooperative law, you do need land titles, but what the cooperative has been doing, and I think that's part of the reason why there's only 157 women members of the cooperative. What the cooperative has been trying to do was being more flexible in land requirements. So they have something called assigned land, where your husband or your father could assign you a part of land. You don't have the legal land title, but they could be assigning part of it in name, and in some cases that would count. That would be good enough. But yeah,
so there's a linkage to land ownership or right to use land. You said something like 30%, was it? Was that
22% in 2003, so I don't know if it's,
so
yeah.
Has the cooperative resulted in more women, for instance, having ownership, or has ownership of land or the right to use land increased by the cooperative being developed? And in particular, has the woman's right to land usage or ownership, has that increased because of the cooperative?
Yeah, that's a good area to, actually that's, yeah, one of the indicators is around land, and land is kind of a key part of gender equity, I feel. And it's interesting, talking to the cooperative, they don't really want to touch that issue because it's so political, and it really touches on a lot of these like really embedded notions of land ownership and power relationships. In the movement Lori was talking about, there's a women's movement within Cafinica, within the coffee cooperatives. And land ownership is one of the things they're talking about. They're talking about doing more education work around fathers or husbands around shared land ownership and women's right to land. So there's things going on in that sense. The cooperative, they've identified land as a barrier, but they don't really they don't really want to touch it yet. Yeah, so I don't think it's really changed that much at this point, but maybe later, I don't know. Yeah.
Are there other types of cooperatives in that community?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, are the women involved with them? Are they getting experience also through other types of cooperatives as well?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question too, because something I often forget and I need to remind myself is that they're a part of this cooperative, but that's just one small aspect of their life, and they have all these other things that they're a part of as well. And yeah, so there are a lot of cooperatives in Nicaragua, and so I talked about Procoser working with this other group called Gemas, which is more about women saving or like small, like doing more farmers markets or other types of production, not just coffee. So it could be selling their artisan work or beans or having gardens in their front, having a little garden and selling those things. Though I mostly worked with agricultural cooperatives, but I know in the context of Nicaragua, there's many cooperatives as well, like taxi cooperatives or like, many different kinds. So yeah, a lot of those women, and I think by nature of me talking to women that were a bit more active in the cooperative, they were probably the ones that were more part of more different groups as well. There were some women that were part of groups that were talking about violence against women, and so there's a lot of other factors that come into play, so yeah, for sure.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions, and I think maybe that will have to be the last of our questions. So, Michael, I think you got your hand up just before Maria.
I'm sorry to gender in action here. I wanted to ask a number of questions because it's a fascinating talk. And I'll give you 2. You can decide which one you want to answer.
Oh, okay.
Or whether you want to answer either.
Both.
One is I'd be interested to know a little bit about your own background in co-ops. Was this your first encounter with co-ops? And, you know, how did you come to do a study with co-ops? Well, there's probably an easy answer, but I'd like the larger answer in a little way. And what did you take away from studying a co-op per se? And the other thing is I was interested in, this is a fair trade co-op which is specializing in organic production among other things. I don't know if it's 100% organic, but it's part of the picture. And I just wondered what that has to do with gender too, whether you know, there's some link between women and this approach to farming, or what did you discover about that?
Okay.
2 big questions.
Okay, I think I have time to answer both of them, right? So.
Let Maria ask hers too.
Okay.
Do you want me to answer right now?
Sure, ask yours and then you can hit all 3 of them.
Okay, sounds good.
My question is more related to membership, and you have like an extension of several communities, and the members were around several communities. And my experience in Bolivia was that women couldn't come back, like couldn't go to meetings, couldn't be part of the organization, and that I mean it's a huge thing because it's usually men, the ones that are making those decisions for them. And I mean, in Bolivia, they have that already, like women are passing into their husbands or, you know, fathers to make those decisions for them. So how was your experience there? Like, I mean, did you notice that? Like, did you notice that they weren't able to participate? Or so even for you, like going and trying to introduce focus groups with them was difficult.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with Michael's questions. So in terms of my personal background, so before I worked on this project, I had been involved with cooperatives more as a member. In terms of my banking, I'm part of cooperatives, or I supported cooperatives in terms of just, I knew a little bit about them and I liked their ideas, so I was part of it in that way. It was really great to go to Nicaragua The first time I was there taking Lori's course was kind of the first time I saw cooperatives in a different sense, in kind of an agricultural sense and in terms of a way of building community. I'm from Vancouver, and we have cooperatives there, but it's big, and you often don't meet the membership, and it means something different, I think. So I remember in Lori's class just asking a question like, I just talked to these women about cooperatives, and something like the social premium that you get from fair trade, they make this money, but then they're sharing it with all the community, not just the cooperative members. And that was something that was so fascinating to me, that you have this broader view of community, and it's not just for yourself, and you think about everyone else around you. And that was kind of a really enlightening moment for me. And since I've kind of done this work and just talked to people who believe so strongly in the cooperative movement, and they talk about a sense of cooperativismo, which is actually, they changed it into a noun, and just talking about like cooperatism as something you embody. So I kind of came back, and yeah, I fell in love with cooperatives. Like I really like the idea and the value of it. So now I'm still mostly members of cooperatives, but I don't know. I am really interested in cooperatives as kind of a solution towards a lot of the challenges we face in our communities in Canada as well. So I'm kind of interested in learning about the models in Canada too. So, and then as to the other question around
Organic production.
Right, organic production. Yeah. So yeah, all of the coffee in Prococer was certified organic, and they're really they have really stringent requirements. So it's very easy to lose that if you don't follow it. In terms of women organic production, I didn't talk about it too much in my study, but I know in a colleague that I have who worked in Nicaragua previously the year before, he worked with an organization called La Femme, which is an all-women's fair trade cooperative. And they talked a lot about organic farming and just talking about kind of viewing organic farming both in terms of the health issue of using less chemicals, but also in terms of that kind of respecting the earth and kind of having that relationship with the earth, and having it be important in that way as well. So yeah, that was kind of my understanding of it. And then in terms of Maria, is that your name? Maria's question around membership. Yes, I definitely noticed that in my study. When I worked with the gender specialists in the organization and coming up with how many participants to have in our focus groups, we had a lot bigger numbers than actually came. A lot of the reasons were around, a lot of these women. One of the focus groups, the day before, a lot of the children had gotten vaccinations in the schools, and the children were sick. So then the next day, a lot of course, the mothers would stay home and take care of the children. So in that focus group, only 3 women showed up, and these women, like, their children were older or they had other things. So there were these barriers around women's responsibilities that prevented them. There's also something unique in that I think most of the participants in my group, when we talked about relationships within the family, a couple of them were single, or like were single mothers, or were not living with a partner. So that made it easier. And they talked about that in terms of making it being easier for them to have decision-making positions in the leadership. And also of the women who were living with their partners, for some reason, like for however their relationship came out, like their partners were quite supportive of them, or they had more kind of equitable or more open relationships with their partners. So I do think the people I was able to work with were kind of not unique cases, but they were in situations that were enabled them to participate more. So I see that as one of the limitations in the indicators I came up with. I was able to talk with the women who had already reached certain levels of equity, and it would have been nice to be able to talk to more women who were living in different situations as well. So,
Well, that was a real test of your memory. Well done. Yes, thank you. I want to thank you so much for joining us and for being able to share with us the research that you've done with the support of the Ferdine family. And all the best in whatever it is that you're off to as a result of your studies here at the University of Saskatchewan. I've got just 4 quick things that I want to mention. And then we have an opportunity to try out some of the fair trade products that are at the back of the room here. There's coffee and tea and probably some chocolate or something else that's equally not good for us back there. So the one thing I wanted to say is I forgot to introduce myself. So anybody who is not familiar with me, I'm Lou Hammond-Kettison. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Cooperatives. And it's a pleasure to be back again after a year on sabbatical. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the reason for the filming that's going over here, taking place over here. We're putting all of our seminar presentations up on our website and working toward having the center's seminar series be more accessible to more people across the country, as well as those fortunate enough to be able to join us in person today. The third thing that I wanted to mention is that this is when we have our presentation by a previous recipient, we also take this opportunity to announce this year's recipient. And so it gives me a lot of pleasure to be able to introduce Segis Chunvatar, who is our recipient this year. I'll just give a quick bit of information about what Segi is doing. Segi is a master's student within co-op concentration in the Interdisciplinary Studies program at the University of Saskatchewan. So she's working with many of the faculty associated with the co-op center. Her research is focused on women and women's experience in Mongolia, and looking at the role that participation in cooperatives, or how participation within cooperatives contributes to more engagement in the larger political process. So we're very excited about seeing the results of Segi's research, and on her behalf, I'll thank the Ferdine family for being able to support the research that she hopes to undertake this summer back in Mongolia as well. So the other thing I wanted to just mention is that the next seminar, and if I can read the handwriting that's in front of me here, our next seminar will be on March 22nd. Yeah, I don't know if it's in this room, but it'll be at the same time, between 3 and 4:30. We're very pleased to have joining us Michael Zellmer, who's with Fair Trade Canada. So we'll be taking the fair trade topic just a little bit further. He'll be looking at it in a slightly different way. And I think that his presentation is called Cooperative Solutions, How the Fair Trade and Organic Coffee Markets Support Forested Ecosystems on Nicaraguan Coffee Farms. Is that correct? Okay. So we'll also be revisiting Nicaragua as well. And so an opportunity to talk a little bit more about the role of cooperatives more generally within that context. And I also should mention that, that Michael Zellmer is at the refinery the evening prior to our seminar, so on March 21st, giving a presentation at 7 o'clock that evening as well. So if you can't catch the seminar, you can catch him at another time. So thank you again to Jannie, and thank you to everyone for joining us, and please have some refreshments, and a very special thank you to the Ferdine family for joining us today.